Very warm welcome back. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here again, and presumably that's because Chris's talk was so interesting and generated so much interest that we couldn't get through all the questions. He's very kindly agreed to come back. So very warm welcome to you again, Chris. I've tidied up the questions and I've divided them up into a few different categories. But first of all, quite a number of the comments weren't questions. A lot of them were saying, thank you for a very interesting talk. Thank you for being so much informative, and getting so much information into a relatively short space of time. Also, there were 2 or 3 people asked if there was anywhere they could get access to your slides.
Absolutely. I'm very happy to send them over to skeptics for distribution for anybody who wants them.
Thank you very much. If you could do that, we'd be very grateful, because there were a few people who wanted just to look into it a bit more.
My pleasure. Okay.
So the first subject that I picked out, which we didn't talk about a lot on Thursday, is personal responsibility. There were quite a few questions about us, the end users, and how big a part does educating us play? Specifically, people were asking about things like teaching us to boil only the amount of water we need, little things like that, and lights off, laundry at specific times of day, right through to bigger things like clothing and cars. Is it going to be important?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I think it is important. What we do as individuals, of course, has very limited impact on the world. This is a global problem. There are 8 billion of us. Each individual has no impact directly whatsoever. But social movements all start from groups of people saying they do not wish to participate in a system which is creating a greater and greater problem every day. The best example of this, of course, is slavery. The move against slavery, institutionalized slavery in Britain, in England particularly, in the late 18th century, took a long time to build up. But nevertheless, people simply saying, I am not going to eat sugar, was one of the most important ingredients in the eventual vast political change that took too long to occur, but did eventually occur. The same thing is going to happen here. We're beginning to get an understanding that we do have an individual responsibility. We are required to get to know exactly what it is that how our actions create emissions. The problem, of course, is that it's often the most uncomfortable things to stop that would actually have the most impact on us and act as the most powerful signal to those people around us. The most important thing many of us can do is to stop flying, or to minimize the amount of flying we can do. I realize that's a very uncomfortable thing to say, but the emissions from that dwarf all other activities. Second thing is the meat industry. I mentioned in the presentation that agriculture is about 25% of global emissions. For those of us who are heavy meat eaters, that will be the second most important element in our life. And a move towards a diet that is more like a traditional vegan diet and away from eating meat, particularly beef and sheep, will be an important personal change that we can make. It's not so much that we are going to make an effect on doing this, but we have then become part of a movement which has a chance of adjusting the way politics, the political system in general, actually begins to take hold of the climate change problem.
That's interesting, because another question, get greenhouse emissions down enough in livestock and dairy farming, or should we be moving to a plant-based diet? And I think you've just been pretty clear about that.
As far as I can see, if we grow cattle, particularly in feedlots, for meat, we are going to be stuck with very high levels of emissions into the future. In the end, a meat-based diet is, I think, incompatible with climate stability. A little bit of meat here and there, particularly pork and poultry, is not going to make much of a difference, but cutting out beef and sheep meat, lamb, will have a dramatic difference on your emissions often.
Will that change in land use have much of an effect on biodiversity?
Right. So we're into a very complicated area here, aren't we, Cleo? That ideally, we would want to allow the land which we're currently using for beef and particularly sheep grazing, to return to a wild, to the way it would have been before humankind arrived, which would have a dramatic effect on biodiversity, beneficial effect on biodiversity, if we allowed genuine rewilding. That's a slow process, the kind of thing that George Monbiot has been so effectively advocating over the last 5 years. It's a slow process. And in my view, that might be okay for 10% of the UK, but for the other 20% that we want to give over to give back to forestry, there is an argument for making that making human intervention to speed up the growth of trees and to make sure that the capture of carbon in those trees is maximized, and build an industry around it, giving employment to the people in the peripheral areas of the country who are otherwise reliant on agricultural subsidies.
That also then feeds into one of the worries was that a lot of our biomass for the power stations was coming from abroad. If we could grow our own forests, then that would help with that, wouldn't it? Yeah,
and we managed them in a way that was traceable. We are, as I said I believe, if I remember correctly, in the presentation, we are the second most important importer of wood products in the world, behind China. A lot of that arises from the fact that the large biomass power stations at Drax and on the Thames are using enormous quantities, principally of North American biomass, North American tree products, to make the pellets which act as their fuel. Now, there's a big debate about whether that's sustainable, genuinely sustainable or not. In my view, it probably isn't, but we can build a biomass industry in the UK that still captures more carbon than it burns. So it acts as a net benefit. It acts as though it is of net benefit to the climate. This is a very sensitive, very complicated issue. Opinions are widely divergent on this. People get very worked up about it. We do need to have more of a national discussion on it. But that, I believe, is a good use for the land that we give up from low quality pasture.
That actually is very optimistic. I think one of the things that people were more worried about was large scale arable to replace the meat-based diet, whether that would be detrimental in any way.
No, I don't think it is detrimental. Animals are a very, very inefficient method of creating food from land. A typical cattle, if I remember the numbers correctly, a typical cow takes 4 units of food to make 1 unit of meat. In other words, we need a lot more land to grow the food in the form of meat than we would do if we were growing it in the form of pulses or grains. Better for us, better for the environment, better for biodiversity, and certainly better for global heating.
Brilliant, thank you. And moving on to transition, a number of people are worried about the costs of preparing to go carbon free. And what about the embodied carbon in renewables and energy storage, EVs?
Right. Can I deal with embedded carbon in renewable electricity sources first? With recent advances in efficiency in solar power, in solar panels and wind turbines, the embedded carbon now represents, in general, there are specific exceptions to this, particularly in areas where the wind speeds aren't very high or there isn't much sun, but in general, in good locations, the carbon invested in the manufacture of that equipment is paid back in energy terms within 6 months. Maybe a year, but often within 6 months. And for example, in a solar panel put on a roof today is probably going to be working in 35 years. So yes, we are getting a very good return on our energy investment in solar, and it's getting better all the time. Batteries is more difficult. The energy return is good, but it does require a lot of mining, in particular of metals which are not in huge oversupply, cobalt being one example. And there are, of course, human rights issues as well with the mining of cobalt, which is dominated by the Democratic Republic of Congo. So, yeah, there are sustainability issues here, and there are issues of human rights. Absolutely no question about it. But I see nothing in the energy revolution which necessarily is blocked by those two categories of problem. We just need to be aware of it and put it at the top of every list of questions that we ask about our energy future.
I remember on Thursday, you were talking about new battery technologies, which sounded quite hopeful, and the end of cobalt batteries.
Yes, there are certain signs that big manufacturers are moving entirely away from cobalt. There are battery manufacturers in China now which are not using cobalt at all. I believe most Tesla batteries no longer contain cobalt. We can get rid of cobalt. We'll still need vast quantities of lithium, and we will probably need quantities of other metals such as nickel. Nickel's in very, very wide supply, so it's not a particular issue. There's no question we are going to need to mine lithium from areas that are not currently used. There is, for example, the prospect of mining lithium in Cornwall, particularly out of the water in abandoned mines. Nobody particularly likes to have mining, but we are going to need to mine vast quantities of lithium over the next few years. We may switch away to sulfur-based batteries, but that's not proven yet. And we also need to develop a worldwide 100% recycling industry for lithium-ion batteries. That does not exist at all at the moment.
Yes, that sounds really important, especially I have a mental health background, and obviously lithium's fairly important there too. There were a number of questions about your houses in Nottingham. Was it expensive to refurbish them?
Right. Those were very expensive. Those costed, if I remember rightly, and it's in the book, forgive me for forgetting it, I think something like over £100,000 each. They were the first in the UK. The next generation of them have been much cheaper, and the social company that is propounding this technology is now quoting figures of around €40,000 for that complete total refurbishment on the latest houses it's been doing in the Netherlands. I haven't checked those figures, sounds reasonable. It's the process of standardization of mass manufacture that's going to pull that cost down. And we need, I'm afraid, to accept that if we're going to improve our housing stock, and that's absolutely urgent across the whole of the UK, we'll need to change the external appearance of them. This is not popular. People like Victorian houses, but they are one of the worst sources of greenhouse gases in the UK today.
Do you think that we can, obviously it'll be much cheaper if this is all built in from scratch, do you think we can persuade construction companies to do that?
They have been very reluctant. This is one of the most old-fashioned, stodgy and inflexible industries that we face. I would like building regulations to be strict and to say you have to get to net zero with all new housing. It would probably add, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 5% to the cost of a house built next year. But very soon the cost would come down to where it was exactly equivalent. There is nothing inherently costly about building zero carbon housing. We've got this illusion created by the construction industry, which is used to a very inefficient, almost medieval way of manufacturing housing, of building houses, that zero carbon is costly. It is not. That's been proved time after time in countries around the world. We need to use regulation to push them into this.
So cement is obviously another issue when it comes to construction. Do you think that we will find a way around it, or do you think we can get to other carbon-free construction processes?
Some people would question which the world faces. Sounds strange, with all the other issues we face, aviation, beef, and things like this. It's cement which people say, this is a problem. There are very low carbon cement today. They're costly. They're not making rapid inroads into their marketplaces. The alternative is to say, okay, we'll use existing technologies for making cement, principally kilns where we heat carbonates and the carbon dioxide comes off. But we have to collect all the carbon dioxide and recycle that into other products, or indeed just put it into the ground and store it there. So my personal belief is that the cement industry will end up by focusing on that, carbon capture and storage from cement, as opposed to other technologies. which may offer cement-like materials, but don't appear to be capable of producing it at the same price.
So we have to hope that a number of these industries realise that these things are going to be in their long-term interests.
Look, there's absolutely no doubt that around the world, that major manufacturers, whether it be cement, steel, or fertilizer, are absolutely aware that they are going to have to change, and they are beginning to spend money. We in the UK are running behind on this. Most of our large companies are pretending the problem will go away, or that some solution will be found, such as giving them the ability to plant trees in Africa, or some other excuse for not doing very much. But the major international manufacturers, steel companies, for example, are utterly, absolutely aware that the use of coal making steel will be impossible in a relatively small number of years. So we're seeing rapid innovation, and we're seeing developments across the board in those significant industries. I wish the UK and the UK government in particular was more cognizant of the rising trend in other countries for the industrial emissions of CO2 and other gases to be treated seriously, and regulation being introduced to make sure that companies behave in a way that is right for the long-term health of the climate.
Thanks. Carbon offsetting then, how much should that feature in planning? I'm just thinking, I'm for one tick the box when I used to fly, but I didn't know what it meant. I just felt good about ticking a box. I mean, is it important? Is it?
Negative emissions. Let's say we're going to need to fund things which take carbon dioxide out of the air and keep it, because we're never probably going to be able to completely stop this society or any other society from emitting CO2, from doing things which result in CO2 emissions. The current generation of carbon offsetting processes, products, are, broadly speaking, complete scams. There are some exceptions to that. I don't want to be too rude. There are forestry products which really work. But the idea that large companies have, the oil companies are the worst at this, saying, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to plant 10,000 hectares of trees, and that's going to cover all our emissions. That's not going to work. If I, as you say, tick the box on a flight and say I'm going to offset that, that does not actually directly reduce the emissions, net emissions anywhere else in the world. I talk about this in the book. There are genuinely effective offsetting schemes. They tend to be very expensive, but they do work. And if you need to take a flight, then look at those ones, not just ticking a box on the Ryanair booking form on your computer.
Right, I feared as much. Thank you very much. In other words, we've got to be a bit more proactive.
Yeah, it's not. We're not able to. We may be able to offset 2-3% of total world emissions through increased forestation. We can't. But yet, every single oil company in the world is now saying that they are going to engage in tree planting as a way of reducing their responsibility for emissions. It simply isn't going to work.
We'd have a world just covered in trees by the sound of it, if they
were.
Well,
there's just not enough land. There's just not enough land area to do this, you know.
So there were some questions about some of the specific technologies you talked about. You were talking about how in Germany and a lot of other countries things are much more decentralized. And someone asked whether power microgrids had any role to play in that move.
Should we explain roughly what a power microgrid is?
Yes, it would help me as well.
Right. I mean, what we have in the UK is, broadly speaking, a national system. So it is the UK. That is to say, the island of Britain, not the island of Ireland, where every single property that's connected to the grid is part of one single national grid. What a microgrid is an attempt to create a system that is separable from that national grid. It may be attached to it wherever it is, in California, in Africa, in India, or in Britain, but it can sit independently, generate its own electricity for the users on that network. So it has batteries, it has renewable electricity systems, it has devices to make sure that electricity and supply and demand are balanced. And all this can be islanded, it can be separated from the national grid. And it does look as though this is a very, very good way of getting local communities to be able to control their own energy supply system. And in particularly in remote areas, whether it be Australia, India, or parts of Scotland, this is a very good way of minimizing the cost of electricity, because it's often cheaper to generate electricity locally than it is to transport it very large distances. Our electricity bills, we're all getting through the post, not through the post, but we're all getting our electricity bills. About the same amount of that electricity bill is going to the people who run our distribution system as who are actually generating the electricity in the first place. It's becoming more and more important, more and more costly. A microgrid is a way of avoiding some of that cost and allowing local communities to control more effectively the supply and demand for electricity, particularly trading it amongst themselves. So if I've got the solar power on my roof, my neighbour wants to run a kettle, I can sell her my surplus electricity and the transaction occurs between us. Very early stage, but blockchain and other modern digital technologies are making this possible in a way that wasn't even envisageable 5 years ago.
So that would include being able to use, people able to share their battery storage for their solar power or their battery on their electric car. Yeah. They'd all be part of this grid?
They'd all be part of it. So the microgrids that are being developed, some of the most interesting ones are actually in the US state of Vermont, with a very progressive utility there that's developing this. Effectively what's called virtual power plants. So everybody with batteries and solar power on the roofs or whatever is in effect part of an isolated system which is trading supply and demand inside that small area. Particular benefit of that in Vermont is subject to weather problems, and as a result, microgrids in a place like that produce very much higher levels of reliability than would be generally the case for a huge distributed grid.
Yeah. A very different question now. Is there any future in hydrogen cars?
Okay, I'm going to go out on a limb and say no.
Right.
Okay. This is a contentious statement. Fuel cell cars have been around a long time, and the reason is I don't think the economics ever make any sense against a straightforward battery car. We're seeing battery cars coming onto the market now with 250 miles range, reliable. They're expensive, but I can tell you a fuel cell car would be very much more expensive. I don't know the exact price of the major fuel cell car on the market today, that is to say a hydrogen car, the Toyota Mirai, but I think it's something like £65,000. In other words, it's a ridiculously expensive car, and there's no sign much cheaper. No, I think batteries have won this battle.
Right. Somebody asked whether capacitive storage batteries would be better than batteries.
It's often talked about, but what Mr. Musk has done at Tesla has pushed the cost of lithium-ion storage down to levels which are now hugely competitive with all other forms of energy storage. It's very difficult to see even some of the most interesting technologies for storage, such as capacitors, large-scale capacitors, or pumped air, or compressed air rather, being able to compete with the kind of prices that Tesla has now has pushed the price of the lithium-ion batteries down to around possibly as low as $60 US per kilowatt hour.
Right. Thanks. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to ask you a final question now, which I'm not sure I understand. And there were a few questions about potential technologies. So I'll ask you whether these are, so I don't know whether they are wacky or terribly sensible. They included...
I'm not sure I will either, Cleo. I'm not sure I will. Sorry.
Well, I'll try them. Was it recycling waste plastic to make new fuels was one? And another one was using methanol as a starting point using solar furnaces and molten salt.
Right. Okay. So, first of those, using existing hydrocarbon-based products, petrochemical-based products such as plastics, can we get energy out of them? Yes, we can. We can take that back to a useful product, whether it be through a combustion process or through general recycling. The question I would ask anybody propounding this is, should we be producing that plastic in the first place? We've had to extract oil to make that plastic. We may be able to reuse it, but each stage it will go through, it loses some of its energy value, and that energy is being lost as CO2 eventually to the atmosphere. So we want to minimize plastic use. We want to minimize all forms of waste product. And it is not going to be ever, even if on the basis of current use, it's never going to be a significant source of energy for the world. The second thing, the use of methanol as an intermediary, as a combustible intermediary. Methanol is a very simple chemical with oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon in it. It can act as a storage system for hydrogen. It can be burnt effectively as a substitute for petrol in some circumstances. So yes, methanol may have a role to play in as what is called in the jargon a storage vector, efficient to make, cheap furnaces. And so yes, I'd be much more positive about that. But we still haven't got anybody that's quite making it work financially.
So I'll wrap up with a follow-up question of my own, actually, because not using oils is obviously the biggie. Are there many good replacements for plastics? I feel like there must be.
Well, we can make plastics from biological sources. We can make them also biodegradable. There is inherently energy use in that, but we can make some progress away from petrochemical-based plastics. I would say the same thing, though. In the end, what we want to make sure is that we continue to use plastics. We can't avoid using plastics. They're highly beneficial to modern society. But we've got to make them so that they last. The idea of buying something in a plastic container, using it, and then throwing the plastic container away is 20th century. We've got to move to the point where every single bit of plastic that we use is 100% recycled or kept forever. Car manufacturers are pretty good at that. All the plastics in cars, modern cars today, are pretty much 100% recyclable. We've got a long way to go, however, with most consumer goods, small-scale consumer goods, the kind of things we buy in supermarkets.
Thank you. You've actually taken us full circle to personal responsibility, and not just personal responsibility, but putting pressure on manufacturers to do things that we want them to do, like not wrap things in 10 layers of plastic, as a very simple suggestion.
Yes, indeed. And funnily enough, most manufacturers want us to demand environmental consciousness from them. Now, the manufacturers are very generally, most industries that I've ever come across, very, very aware of the environmental problems that result from them. But if nobody wants to buy the things which are more environmentally, they're left with no business. So they tend to stick with what they're doing. So it's up to us to alter our consumption patterns and show manufacturers that what we want is the environmentally friendly alternative.
Brilliant. I think that's a wonderful note to finish on. So thank you very much once again. And I think we've held all our viewers. So you were fascinating. And can everyone do a big virtual round of applause again? And thank you so much for joining us a second time. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for everything. Thanks. Bye-bye.